Let's return briefly to the example involving Dwight Freeze as we look to wrap up the last two segments of this course. After the process of getting Dwight placed appropriately in a facility, it became clear that A, his money was not going to last, and B, the family was entirely opposed to any of the nursing homes they visited that accepted Medicaid. So at the time, while Dwight's family was researching this, they were continuing to pay about $10,000 a month for him to live in a non-Medicaid caregiving facility. As his condition declined more and more physically, when he became non-ambulatory and his level of, or his ability to be verbal was diminishing, the home that he was in told his daughter that it was time for him to leave there. They weren't a custodial facility, and he actually didn't really have much medical necessity for a full skilled nursing facility. So in response to that, and being unable or unwilling to use any other options, Dwight's daughter came and picked him up from the facility that he was in and took him back home. Back home to the same place that before he had had his outbursts that had caused issues with the neighbors and so forth and so on. And the behavior continued. Almost every day, Dwight would engage in what some people sort of jokingly call sundowner syndrome, which just was essentially the fact that he would have cycles during the day, particularly in the evening, where he would become unusually agitated or extremely agitated and sort of go through the process of yelling and fighting and all manner of sort of dementia-driven activities. And it came to a head after a couple of months of that, that the homeowners association in the complex that they lived sent a letter to Dwight and his daughter and said, you have to remove him from here. We're getting complaints, and people don't feel comfortable living around here, and blah, blah, blah. So at this juncture, Dwight's daughter had been taking care of him almost in a full-time capacity for several months, and had really been deciding on his care leading up to this instance. She is now, as we look at the place that she's in this story, she is now desperate. She's tried homes. There's not money. There is no money for further non-Medicaid homes, and she doesn't want him to be in a facility that she feels is run down or improperly staffed or whatever the case might be. And she is truly at her wit's end. When caregivers reach that point, bad things happen. Most of the time, elder abuse is quite different than child abuse. Elder abuse isn't the act of beating an elderly person with a belt or putting their hand on a hot stove. Abuse and neglect in an elderly population takes the form of embezzling money or rerouting someone's money. It takes the form of being far more physically rough with a patient than is necessary. It takes the form of being neglectful of appropriate food and water or appropriate changing. And when caregivers burn out, the risk of them doing those things or failing to do those things skyrockets. Everyone has a limit. And Dwight had essentially been in a position where his daughter had now spent almost 25 years trying to take care of him in some capacity. And she had spent the last couple of years even having to be responsible for activities of daily living. She fed him 3 times a day. She brought him water to drink several times a day. And again, he's non-ambulatory, non-verbal. He can't do this on his own. She has to literally hold the cup and pour it into his mouth so that he'll drink. Despite Dwight's loss of context and memory and almost everything, till the day that Dwight died, he retained a knowledge or an instinct against having his clothes removed, which obviously makes total sense. The problem was is that Dwight was incontinent of bowel and bladder, and he was not capable of changing his own clothes. So there was no way to get him through an episode of changing without having to physically fight through the fact that he would swing his arms wildly and kick his legs and obviously expressed tremendous displeasure and discomfort with what was taking place. And if you haven't lived through it, let me assure you that no matter how much someone's dementia is responsible for what they're doing, it is an emotionally and physically taxing experience to care for someone who not only is totally dependent on you, but is actively and physically difficult for you to work with and to do your job. It's really, really hard for a caregiver or a family member to spend 20 minutes fighting an old man just so that you could put clean trousers on him, and then you're supposed to go home to your family or you're supposed to go to bed and sleep. It's hard. It doesn't help if you're walking down the hall of a facility and you hear a resident of a room just screaming racial epithets and that kind of thing. It doesn't make it any easier. It doesn't make it easy to deal with, even though you know that dementia is the cause. And Dwight's daughter reached a breaking point in how she was able to care for him. And her resolution to the problem is an excellent example of what happens when caregivers violate their professional boundaries or they violate their own natural and physical boundaries. When she reached a point of breakdown, she loaded Dwight in a wheelchair. She put him in a wheelchair van that she rented, and she drove about 8 hours to Dwight's grandson's house without ever having a phone conversation with Dwight's grandson. She literally pulled up in the grandson's driveway with Dwight in the van in a wheelchair. She knocked on her son's door, his grandson's door, and said, "I can't take it anymore. I can't deal with this. I can't just, it's not even just that he can't live with me, it's that I simply cannot be responsible for him. I can't feed him 3 times a day. I've fought this, I've done this for as long as I possibly can, and I just can't do it anymore." Her inability to plan that, her ability to just sort of show up on her son's doorstep with Dwight in the car, again, non-ambulatory, non-verbal, totally dependent, life-changing experience, and not even able to explain that this was going to happen. It was clear that there was a serious risk of abuse and neglect should this situation continue. This week we're talking about professional boundaries, and that sort of thing is a violation of a boundary of the highest order. You should, as healthcare professionals, always be cordial and polite and respectful of your patients. It's hard to become friends with some of them, and sometimes friendships with patients are not incredibly healthy. But regardless of that, regardless of how you feel in developing those relationships, crossing boundaries is always an issue for healthcare providers, and many healthcare providers don't really understand what that means. Giving money is crossing a boundary. Sometimes having conversations about intimate things is violating a boundary. Showing up in a driveway of a family member with a completely dependent loved one in the back and no phone call about what was taking place or what is taking place is absolutely a violation of boundaries. And it's a tough one because it's essentially an admission of saying, if I continue to have Dwight in my home, this isn't going to end well for him or me. And so when caregivers feel overwhelmed by the act of having to take care of patients, sometimes who are like Dwight, it's incredibly important that you utilize the resources available to you to help ease those burdens and sort of ease those pains so that you don't cross the professional boundaries associated with providing care to people who might actually be quite difficult to provide care for.